Today on the Cameron Journal podcast, we are happy to welcome Joshua Pearce. He has written a new book called Create, Share, and Save Money Using Open Source Projects.
This is the Cameron Journal podcast. It's a place where we talk about important things. It's a place where we bring a little slice of the news to you. It's a place where we do important things, have important conversations. It's also things that I like to talk about. My name is Cameron Cowan, and this is the Cameron Journal podcast.
Hello, Joshua. How are you?
Hello, very good. Thank you for having me.
Excellent. So, let's talk about your new book out now. Why don't you tell us a little bit about it, where you got your inspiration to teach people how to save money using open source projects, and why you put this together?
Sure. So I have a kind of a long storied history in open hardware. In my lab at Michigan Tech, we use it to develop all of our equipment to do science and engineering. And we've been saving, at this point, hundreds of thousands of dollars in the lab. And we do that by taking advantage of technologies that have already been developed in the open hardware community, bringing them into our lab, further developing them, and then resharing them into the community. And for scientists, this has worked extremely well. There's now hundreds of different designs. Most any type of science that you can think of has been touched by it. And what I was trying to do with this new book is show that that same sharing mentality can really benefit people that aren't necessarily scientists. And the open source has really touched every aspect of people's lives today, and they can take advantage of some of the really great freebies that are out there, from photographs and videos to books to music to science equipment, all the way down to toys for your kids, can be fabricated using open source digital technologies and providing enormous wealth for people, even if they don't have a lot of money.
That makes sense. I want to specifically kind of dive into, at least at first, the idea of open source. It's the type of thing people have heard of, but don't know much about. So why don't you explain what the open source idea is and how all that works?
Sure. So open source originally came from software development. And what it meant is that the source code, the actual writing of the program, it was open, or people could look at it and see it. And open source is actually sort of a shortening of free and open source. And so it meant that you could not only see the code, but you were also free to do with it what you wanted. You could compile it and run the program. You could change it. You could sell it. And with the open source licenses that have been set up in software and now copied over to hardware, they say you can do all those things, but if you change it, if you make an improvement, you're obligated to reshare it back with the community. And so in software, this has just exploded. Basically, every internet company you can think of, Facebook, Google, Amazon, all of them run open source software on the back end. They're all major developers in open source software because it makes better software when you have lots of people working on it together and everybody kind of resharing the best things about it. And so what's happened very recently is some of the digital fabrication technologies, things like 3D printers and laser cutters and CNC mills, have now matured to the point where I can design a file, send it to you, and you can send it to your 3D printer, your laser cutter, and you can get the same object out that I made. And so now we're trading hardware designs, we're trading the source code or the open source of hardware the same way we're used to with computer programs.
Yes, and that makes sense. So because obviously this wouldn't be possible without 3D printing. So why don't you talk a little bit about how this idea of, I guess, shareable code and 3D printing, how do these two things go together, and why on earth would someone attempt to 3D print something at home?
Sure. So 3D printing is probably one of the best examples of open source hardware really succeeding. So 3D printing itself, where you're building an object up into a three-dimensional product in layers, has been around since the 80s. It's an old technology, but the only reason that you've heard of it only recently is that up until now it cost hundreds of thousands of dollars, and only major research labs or kind of large corporations like a GM would have access to one. And a couple years ago, at this point, the patents for the basic 3D printing processes ran out. And when that happened, a professor in Britain open sourced the first self-replicating rapid prototyper. So it was a 3D printer that could 3D print itself, and it was open source. And so myself and many other people from all over the world were like, oh my gosh, this is awesome. We can now like build our own 3D printers. Got onto the project, and the price of 3D printers went from hundreds of thousands of dollars down to this point. You can buy a pretty decent 3D printer for $250. And the 3D printer that you buy can do everything the ones that used to be able to do, kind of like the turn of the century. They're faster, they're lighter, they break less often. Like everything about them is superior, and it came because of all this open source sharing. And because the people that were developing 3D printers for the last decade or so have all been in that kind of, or many of them have been in this open source modality, many of the things that we started out as 3D printable were pieces of 3D printers themselves. But today there's millions of open source designs for pretty much anything you can think of, available on repositories where you can download a free design, send it to your 3D printer, and print it out. And like our group does a lot of very high-end scientific tools. So if you're a science teacher in a high school, there's no reason that you should be paying hundreds of dollars for a microscope when you can 3D print one. If you happen to be into semiconductor physics, I got all kinds of toys for you. We routinely make devices that are worth more than $250,000 for a couple $1,000s using a 3D printer. And that's just on the science side. Kind of everyday people that have no interest in science whatsoever can 3D print adaptive aids for their maybe the grandparents that have arthritis. They can 3D print consumer goods, like things that you need around the house. You can 3D print toys for your kids. At this point, more and more of the products that you'd buy at Walmart or Amazon are available in open repositories.
Okay, that makes sense. So in terms of, so if we're doing open source and sharing and all this type of thing, we live in capitalism. Who is making money off of all of this? How does it keep going, I guess, without a lot of venture capital or something else behind it?
So the only people I know for sure that lose out in this sort of sharing-based economy are actually the venture capitalists. Normal, when you think of like a small and medium-sized enterprises are doing quite well, and you can even have quite large businesses that have an open source component to them. So the classic example of software comes from Red Hat. It was a multi-billion-dollar company. It just got purchased by IBM, where their core product was a version of Linux that was free. You could literally download it, put it on a DVD or CD, and sell it on the street corner. But they were made money because they sold a service on top of it, and their service was superior because of this giant open source community behind them. And so there's lots of people that use that sort of service model to be able to sell open source things, whether it's music or books or electronics, all different kinds of businesses. But there's also many other types of business models. A good example might be something like a Facebook, who contributes a lot to open hardware development on the back end for running their servers, yet they're still making lots and lots of money, basically offering advertising through their platform. And so you can have the sharing and you can have the superior technology, but people still make money. On the 3D printing side, some of the most successful 3D printing companies in the US, in Europe, and in China are open source companies. They have the best 3D printers available. They're selling the most 3D printers because they're all constantly improving and innovating in order to stay alive. At the same time, there's things like the raw materials. So the vendors that are selling the plastic for 3D printing are making lots of money. And there are, I would say the designers can also make money by doing special things for individuals or for companies. And so there's lots of capitalism still going on. Open hardware and open source in general is certainly not anti-capitalist, but it provides a way for people to have more control over the products that they own and want for themselves.
Yeah, and that makes sense. It seems like it would be odd that, someone makes a big contribution to making a widget, and then some company decides to sell the widget. The poor person who came up with the good idea seems to be getting cut out. thanks to all
Well,
this open sharing and such.
possibly, but you have to think about how you would share your particular thing or how you would want it to work. And so let me give you an example. Let's say that you're a cell phone company and you have a product that's on the market, but you're kind of tied into your suppliers. You only have one supplier for each of the components that make up your cell phone. It would benefit you in a huge way if you started to open source some of those components. So say like the GPS chip. If you open source that and have lots of companies then have the potential to fabricate it and to build on it and to make it better, you're going to get a better chip for less money. And then for your customers that you're selling a phone to, and the phone isn't necessarily open source, even though many of the components are, you're able to provide more value to your customers and make more profit while encouraging open hardware. And so that's just one example of how the model of how you do business, the business model, just shifts slightly in order to remain successful.
No, that definitely makes sense. So I'm gonna let the listener in on a little secret because I have interesting questions. So listeners should know, all my listeners know, I'm the editor in chief of RougesMagazine.com. 2 weeks ago, Joshua and I did a whole hour-long talk for a feature for the magazine that will be coming out in November at some point, likely after this has gone up. Or aired, because I used to work in terrestrial radio and I still think in those terms. And so after this has been up with all this sort of thing. And we had a very interesting discussion about the economics of this whole thing. And it makes for interesting conversation, so I'm going to return to this idea. One of the things we talked about, as I said, when it comes to open sharing of information, I have spent my life working in an industry that was completely murdered by open sharing of too much information. And because the internet, video may have killed the radio star, but internet killed the journalist star. And
Right.
so one of the things that we talked about and had some conflict about was if the internet and open sharing of too much information killed journalism, won't open source sharing of software, information, and hardware kill pretty much everything else? I mean, now the other day they 3D printed a car, and the car is brilliant. It actually it was an AI 3D printed car, and the AI actually solved some interesting hardware issues, especially with control arms and suspension and all this type of thing. And it modified parts that frequently break and reinforced them and all this type of thing. It was as a motorhead. It was fascinating the way the AI used 3D printing to solve problems auto manufacturers have been working on for decades. And so my question is, won't open source pretty much kill everything else the same way the internet killed journalism?
So that's a great question, but I think we want to separate automation of potential jobs from open source. So I think, as you pointed out, automation is coming, and it's coming strong for every type of job you can think of. It is hard for me to imagine a position that can't be automated in the near future, either by robotics or by some form of AI and computer code. And the code is getting better and stronger and faster, and it's wiping out more traditional type jobs.
That's a big problem.
That is a huge problem. And I have concerns about everything. There are textbooks you can buy now as a professor that come with modules that correct students like physics problems in real time with them drawing on the screen. And so there's basically nothing as my own job that couldn't be automated. And that includes the research end of it. There's programs that develop innovation strategies on physical problems. So you input the physical problem, and then it tells you the physical ways that it can be solved. And it's only one more step where you've taken out the entire inventive process and completely turned it over to AI. What open source does, though, is provide a soft landing for all of us. And so its power is to put the control of the products in the hands of the people. And so rather than having to pay a monopoly AI run, Fortune 100 company in the future, you can make the product yourself using very, very little capital. And so instead of being tied, the vast majority of the capital is relatively concentrated. Now people with very small access to capital, even in the developing world, have the ability to manufacture some of their own products and solve some of their own needs. And the wealth that is being acquired in the open source community is now truly amazing. There's more videos that you could watch than you have time for in your lifetime. There's more books you could read. There's huge amounts of wealth that have been stored up and are now being shared that kind of benefit all of us. And so as things become automated, one of the ways that you can maintain control is to participate in this kind of open source ecosystem. If you don't, if you imagine a world where there was no open source ecosystem and everything gets automated, humanity's in for a really rough time.
Well, yes, and I think I think that's one of the interesting. As you know, I've sat with this, and my tech editor has sat with this, and all this sort of thing. He's a very big Linux open source guy, Robbie Pence, and yeah, and it's it's one of those things where he's always waiting for a tool or whatever to improve, and he kind of chortles because I shell out all this money for subscriptions to wonderful services like Evernote and things like that I use, and I just pay because I could never ever contribute anything to your lovely open source world because that's not what I do.
I think you actually are doing it. This podcast is a great example.
Yeah, well, yes, I can tell other people to investigate what you all are doing. But all this sort of thing. He's always waiting for new tools, and I find it an interesting. I find it an interesting idea in terms of sharing all this type of thing. I find it interesting that there's still business and things to be done. And I think the most fascinating part, one of the things that you mentioned before, and I think is worth talking about now, is that because it's kind of all open and available, it actually makes competition more fierce. For once, it makes capitalism work in our favor, which has not happened in 300 years. It's because people get so competitive because the information is all out there. It's just a matter of what you do with it.
No, I think you're absolutely right. And if you look at the successful open source electronics companies, so rather than spend more money on lawyers, they put more money in engineers, and they're constantly churning. And SparkFun does this kind of like really great example of where, they come out with something and you can see it being fabricated by a copy shop somewhere over in China. And they kind of laugh at it because by the time it's copied and remanufactured by somebody else, they're already on to the next version. And they're on to the next version because their customers have given them feedback. And that feedback is maybe, this works, or I would really like this, but it's also some technical feedback where the customers are becoming co-creators of the next version of the product. And so it's coming out so fast and so strong. The technology is so good. Like they're on this, like either just running, where kind of older technologies, particularly where you patent something and sit on it for 20 years, it's like, you're sitting on the couch, you're not moving at all. And so right now we're seeing enormous churn on the software side and in some of these newer digital technologies like 3D printing. Like I said, Make Magazine has this 3D printing shootout, and every year an open source 3D printer wins. And you wonder, how is that possible when these very large additive manufacturing companies have had the 20-year head start? They've got hundreds of good, solid engineers, and they can't compete with these little upstart companies. And the reason they can't compete is you're not competing against a company and their couple dozen employees. You're competing against the whole world working together on the weekends and at night and in the bedrooms of high school students to get their 3D printers being superior. And that's what you see, is you just see better products for everybody.
No, that definitely makes sense. Now, to that idea, because we've talked about the economics of all of this and why all of this works. I mean, do you foresee a future where everyday people will have a 3D printer in their home and they will randomly make things either for themselves or for sale?
That's a really good question. So for someone like me, I couldn't see not having one. Like I went for decades kind of growing up without the ability to actualize some of my ideas. And now it's more of a matter of, do I have enough time to try out to do this idea? And I think that the generation that's coming up that is used to this technology, that they learn how to code in kindergarten, they have a 3D printer in third grade, like by the time they graduate, they're going to be expecting things to be open source. They're going to be used to the churn. They're not going to be afraid to go in and change some of the code, whether it's a CAD design or a PCB or a software program. And for that kind of class of upcoming makers, I think they're all going to have 3D printers and probably laser cutters and everything else in their house. For people that aren't into making things, and there definitely are many people that would much rather just pick something up on the web versus make it themselves. I think that provides ample opportunity for open source businesses. And there already are dozens of examples, for example, of 3D printing workshops on the web. So if you want something that's 3D printed, say some really fancy jewelry for a spouse, you can have it printed in gold or platinum, and you probably don't have a gold or platinum printer at your house right now. They're kind of expensive still, but you can get it made by somebody else, and they charge, for the material and the labor the same way you would expect of any other kind of service company, only they're using digital manufacturing to do it. And so that opens up an opportunity for a huge number of entrepreneurs, and there are basically aggregators of 3D printing services. So if I have a 3D printer and I want to make my 3D printer available to other people when I'm not using it, I can offer my services online. I can charge per kind of cubic centimeter of material, and I can make things for other people downloading free designs. And so in that way, I think we can cover everybody's needs out of the open designs that are available today, using these kind of very small businesses. It might just be one person and one printer, or it could be, a fairly large business with hundreds of employees and thousands of printers.
Yeah, that's kind of an interesting. I was thinking about, this sort of decentralized manufacturing future, and I was trying to put my head into the space of, given our present world, what does that look like? How would that work?
Yeah, so I think we got a glimpse of it in this COVID pandemic, where the normal supply chains and mass manufacturers couldn't handle the demand, this massive, huge demand for something that we don't normally think that much about, whether it's N95 masks or face shields or nasal swabs. But the distributed manufacturing community, even though it's really tiny right now, was able to do it. And so like at our local hospitals here, the face shields that went on the nurses that were on the front line when they couldn't buy them anywhere else were manufactured by students and people in their own homes and our library at the university. That they were the ones that had the manufacturing capabilities. And what was really unique about it is, if you think of centralized manufacturers and how they would, they would make a machine that could pump out 10,000 an hour or something like that. Instead, we had a bunch of machines that could pump out, one or two pieces an hour, but at the drop of a dime, all you had to do was change the file that you were sending to the printer, and then it could manufacture something else. And so there was no lead time. There's no retooling of the machines. We could immediately pivot to whatever the needs were. And so much more flexible, much more dynamic type of a manufacturing ecosystem.
Well, yes, and there I could see a tremendous strength, because there's a lot of time and energy and all this type of thing in retooling of factories, and they tend to be fairly fixed, and it's very expensive and all this type of thing. Moving to a world where that's not necessarily the case, especially when you get to really big things, cars, refrigerators, washers, dryers, all this type of thing, costs would plummet, and that would benefit, everyone, especially people in developing nations and all this sort of thing. I can see that, being a benefit sort of thing. But then I also kind of see the darker side, where it's kind of like, well, if this becomes the case, what prevents us from, living in a tent city while everything for those that remain is 3D printed by AI bots owned by like maybe 50 companies the world over? Like, I it after talking, I never had really thought about that, but after talking to you, that dystopia seems incredibly possible. And unfortunately, it might happen in my lifetime. I was hoping I would be dead by the time this would all happen. Um,
Right.
it's kind of like this, give these folks 5 years and it'll all be over, sort of thing, and we'll all be out in the field.
Well, I think though that there's at the same, so technology is moving very fast. Some of the major corporations are, patenting dozens of things a day and all that. But at the same time, the very large world of open source and makers is growing and developing these technologies. And a lot of them are in this kind of quasi open space. So a lot of the things that the government does isn't necessarily commercialized as such. So for example, for your housing, one of the biggest players for 3D printing buildings right now is the US Army. And they're not being overly, cagey about the proprietary nature of what they're doing. They're kind of saying how they're doing it. And so I think it's very realistic in the, near to medium term that we'll have ways to fabricate housing using open source principles. And already today, the Open Building Institute has designs for homes. They're not necessarily 3D printed. They're fabricated in a modular style that are open source, and they're small and efficient, extremely ecologically friendly, very economical, and that's available today. And depending on where you live and what the regulations are where you live, you could build one that, starting this weekend.
Yeah, I mean, housing, I think, is one area where I think this could do a lot. We haven't really changed housing construction, in that at least hundreds of years, if not thousands of years. I mean, I think drywall was the last major innovation in building construction. Um, we're still hammering pieces of wood together and mortaring bricks and all this type of thing, and it all happens by hand. It's all incredibly labor intensive. It's very inefficient. Um, that's kind of all a big sort of problem. So, new developments in housing would be a good idea. But to that though, given that all of this is so automated and a large group of engineers can do so much, can this kind of world that we're talking about, is it going to actionably employ people? Because it seems to me, you and your maker community are going to kind of be this wonderful decentralized manufacturer, but it's not like you need 100,000 people working at an auto plant, because your 3D printers and bots will just sort of do all of this.
Right. But so you might have, and it's very hard to future predict with any kind of accuracy.
The president of IBM in 1949 said no one would ever need the personal computer, and I'm talking to you on an iPhone. So there you go.
Yeah. So I got to be careful here, but what I can say is what I think is at least possible. And so realize that if I can manufacture my own home, that might be very appealing to me, but it might not be as appealing to you. And so you might hire me to do that for you. And I think one of the most exciting things that kind of open source brings to home manufacturing is the ability to truly customize everything about your life. And so instead of buying a cookie cutter, design that an architect did 20 years ago and that every other house on your block looks exactly the same,
yes.
Now you can make your house your own. And that involves every single thing about it. And so if you're into, I don't know, unicorns, you can fill up your whole house with unicorn motifs. Every wall can have unicorns sticking in it. You can have your coat rack with a unicorn horn on it. And then when you get tired of unicorns and instead you want to do dolphins, you can take the materials, reconvert them back into feedstock, and then fabricate something else that you're more interested in that day. And this kind of level of kind of expression and free creativity we've never had before. I don't know if you've ever even tried any of the open source digital painting programs. They're amazing. Like if you gave them to, the ancient classical artists, they would never stop painting. Like they would just keep going. They never have to worry about the cost of canvas. They don't have to worry about the cost of paint. They just keep going and create and share with the entire global world. So we have more and more beautiful things that you can then have digitally replicated on the wall of your apartment for free.
I mean,
or almost free.
Yeah, I mean that it's what a different, world we would be in, if you could have, your very own Rembrandt sort of thing. Um, but then that, but part of the specialness of that is also exclusivity, and I think that's the problem I think I've kind of seen with like how the economy has changed over the years, and I think what open source does differently is a lot of, and this is a flaw, I suppose, but a lot of business models were predicated on exclusivity and an inability to get something, and the only ability to get it through a very set of few channels. Certainly, my business was predicated on that for about 150 years. And then one day the internet came along, and that was the end of that.
Yeah.
And so, this was kind of like, how do we. I think the internet has given us a lesson of what happens when you destroy a bunch of business models and how many people get unemployed. And so now we have to think about, okay, what happens when that hits literally everything else?
Right. No, it is concerning, and I'm kind of well. There's two things about it. So one is that the business models you're talking about now are kind of the old style,
Yeah,
were based on scarcity, and it was artificial scarcity. So
it was.
whether it was some form of intellectual property
Good money in
kept
that.
people from getting it. Oh yeah, yeah, no question
Yeah.
about it. And so what this is doing is providing kind of access to the world's wealth to everybody, which I think is probably a good idea. And one of the ways that we can think about how this might work in the future is many people, when you ask them, like, what do they really want? Like, is it important to them to have millions of dollars? Maybe not. They really want to have just a nice lifestyle. They want to be able to afford education and healthcare and a place to live and live in a nice community. Like, the things that people really want actually aren't that expensive. And then when you throw in all this free stuff to kind of enrich their lives, whether it's, the arts and movies and TV and all these things that are manufactured for very small amounts of money. And then, especially when it's distributed to everybody, where everyone would just pay a small piece, it has a lot of potential to have funding cycles work so that we could provide all the needs and even many of the wants for all of humanity. And I think it will change from, instead of, ha ha ha, I have a Rembrandt in my house and you don't, it'll be more like, well, I have a painting in my house that I made myself. And that's what makes it special, is I'm demonstrating my own talents and skills and creating something that I think is beautiful for myself that I'm sharing with everybody else that might make, I don't know, different versions of it. When we come to this transition, and I can't stress enough that I think automation and open source are not necessarily intertwined. The worst case scenario, I think, is to have the AI be all proprietary, owned by one company, where we all have to pay whatever they happen to, whatever they care to charge us, versus a similar situation where we've eliminated the need for paid work, but we as a community, as the whole world, own everything. I was watching this video of it was an automated food gathering. I think it was like corn, and it had, large, giant, huge trucks working, almost like a ballet with each other to be driving around at full speed while they're harvesting the corn and then trading off which kind of dump truck is getting filled up at a time. And it was amazing. And that's something that AI and computer software could do very easily. It's trivial for them. When we've paid for that process, then everybody gets popcorn for almost no money. And that, who owns those robots? Who owns those AI systems? It's going to depend whether kind of humanity has what I'll call a soft landing, or we end up with the more of a dystopian type system.
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot about food and agriculture and all this sort of thing. And that is an area where I think automation will do to farming what the tractor did to farming. The tractor and implements basically ended agrarian societies in the developed world. We went from 40% of the population working on farms to 2%, and we did it in 50 years. That was tractors and a very early form of automation. I think in the future, if we have farm bots that can fertilize and weed and gather and all this type of thing, farming could virtually be automated with very little human oversight. The farmer as a job probably won't, exist for too many people 50 years from now, sort of thing. Um, and,
Or we could all be doing it. So there's an organization called GOAT. It's the Gathering of Open Source Agricultural Technology.
yeah.
And they are making farm bots with the idea that you would own a farm bot, and in your backyard, you would set this thing loose, and kind of like a Roomba, it would go around, plant seeds, fertilize, clip weeds, and harvest, and you'd get your fresh, organic, local vegetables right at the back door using an open source technology that could be fabricated with other open source technologies. And that's I think the future that many in this area are pushing very hard at.
Yeah, and I think that, that certainly makes food supply lines more resilient. Especially if you can, put it indoors, make it so it kind of works year round ish. I think that could work quite well. But even in situations like we spend a lot of crops go to the feeding of cattle and pigs and chicken and all this type of thing. People don't know that, but the bulk of food grown is not consumed by humans. It's consumed by the other things that we eat. And even for that, I think there's an interesting opportunity for that in the future. But that's also the type of thing that will probably be dominated by someone like Case or Ideal or John Deere or people that make farm equipment, sort of thing.
What's interesting, you bring up John Deere. They are heavily on the other side of the fence on intellectual property.
They are,
and so
it's a huge
they
scandal. Yeah.
Oh, they're fighting against your right to repair your own tractor, and that's what's pushing many farmers over to like groups like Open Source Ecology that are making open source tractors, like quite literally.
Yeah, no, we've run a couple stories on how John Deere's tried to take software where you get a license, you don't really own it, and apply it to somebody's tractor. Which, if anyone has ever met a farmer anywhere, and I'm convinced no one at John Deere ever has, then they would know that the idea of a farmer not fixing his own tractor is like expecting it to rain gumdrops and ice cream tomorrow. It's just insanity. It's just not going to happen. Yeah, and I that's where I see there's so many wonderful potentials of all of this that I see that are possible. I've watched how humans have been slowly replaced by computers and the internet and other things. And I feel like if we don't consciously decide to do this in a certain way, that we're going to end up with the worst of all worlds. And then we'll all answer to Jeff Bezos. And that won't be fun.
Well, I think it will depend a lot on, what country you're living in at the time as these things mature. Europe is taking a very different stance than the U.S. is on a lot of these issues, and in the U.S. we're just not used to thinking of the government that way. We're not used to thinking that we have a social safety net and that something like a guaranteed basic income or something like that would even be theoretically possible. And in other countries, it's borderline that way already. And
certainly,
so, yeah. And you could imagine, there've been lots of proposals for things like, taxiing robots to fund, humanity. Many ways that can happen. But then at the same time, the Jeff Bezoses of the world, right now, I can manufacture many of the things in the Amazon catalog with greater precision, greater function, like they're better products. I can do it in my own house, the comfort of my own home, for substantially less than I pay Amazon. And up until this point in history, That really wasn't possible until, basically after the Industrial Revolution started. It made sense to do centralized manufacturing. It made, it easier and less costly to manufacture in bulk and ship it all over the place. That's no longer true. And the technology that really proved that for me was the humble shower curtain ring. Because if you think about how mass manufacturing should work, there is no way in the world I should be able to manufacture something out of relatively inexpensive plastic in my own home and beat a large scale mass manufacturing plant to do the same thing. And yet, you go onto Amazon today, none of the vendors can match what I can do with recycled plastic waste out of my recycle bin in my own home, a recycle bot, and my 3D printer. So I can print out shower curtain rings for less than a penny or two a piece. And the best you can find online is a couple dollars. And so it's not for like a set of shower curtain rings. And so I can make custom ones that match my interests for far less money than even mighty Amazon can offer them for me for sale.
Yes, and I think, I think that's the best hope for this open source software, hardware, 3D printed future. I think that's the hope. I think broadly speaking a good a good idea. And I think the lower costs of products and all that sort of thing is a smart thing. I do agree with you. In America, we have such a take care of yourself, pull yourself up by your bootstraps, don't depend on government. We have taken great pains to hamstring government at every turn in this country. Yeah, I think it requires such a change in our national thinking to embrace the policies that are going to make this future work for everyone.
Yeah,
Whereas Europe has kind of already figured this out and they're already on board and they're moving forward rapidly. We've got to change our whole national ethos to understand what's about to happen to us.
But I think the baseline is there, though. Like when you talk to individual Americans of any political stripe, they're more or less basically good people, and they will help you. Like if you have an accident or you're in trouble and you ask someone of any political stripe for help, they will help you themselves. So like that's already sort of ingrained and sort of like part of who we are. I don't know did you see the latest Borat film, which is terrible, but it had one really nice piece where Borat is this international can't speak right reporter from somewhere in Europe, and he goes up to a random Trump supporter and asks to stay at his house, and the guy says yes during the pandemic. Like that is a nice guy to do that. Like I'm not even sure I would do that, and I usually think of myself as reasonably nice. That's what makes up America, is people that actually do care for each other. We just have to provide a path for them to be able to do that so that we can. And Europe is a little bit further ahead on having methods to do that. Here, a lot of people fall through the cracks. It's very easy to do. And if they're not part of a community that can kind of help them, you can be in real trouble quite easily.
Well, yeah, I mean that's I think where the difficulty in our society comes. I mean, yeah, it's amazing what people will do in order to help their community. Like when we've had this scandal with the post office and they were getting rid of sorting machines, people of all different backgrounds called their local post office and volunteered to help sort the mail by hand. People just called up and said, "Oh, the mail's not getting sorted. Do you need some help? I will come help sort the mail." Which is just insane that people just volunteered, called up and said, "Oh, I will come help sort the mail." Just Americans are so weird sometimes.
No, there's good people, and I think we're good beneath, and kind of thinking of it even evolutionarily. If you were kind of a selfish jerk back in the caveman era, you didn't have any friends. Like you had no chance to really survive on your own. The people that survived that were our ancestors were the ones that worked together. Like doing it all by yourself. I mean, even just considering something as simple as growing enough of your own food to survive, with no help from anybody else, no kind of sharing of intellectual like ideas, you die. And so the people that survived worked together, they formed groups, and that is how we've been doing it for millennia, is working together kind of in the best interests of all. And so what open source
Well, that's
does
the
is kind of
power of
digitize all that.
civilization, really. Yeah,
Exactly.
yeah, yeah.
Exactly.
Well, yes, and to your you were about to say that's, and I was on the same track. I guess maybe that's the magic sauce of open source, is that it harnesses this collaborative power of humanity.
Mhm.
That's an amazing and magical thing. I think one of the things I would like to note that we have not necessarily touched on, is that 3D printing just doesn't work in plastic anymore. I understand you kind of pioneered printing in steel.
So I guess I pioneered printing in open source steel. So
Yes.
there's been metal 3D printers around for a while too, and they are very expensive. So the really good ones today print in powdered metal with lasers, and they cost $500,000. And there's safety concerns with it, and it's obviously very costly. A lot of people can't get access to it. So what we did is we used a very inexpensive RepRap based 3D printer that we printed in plastic to move a stage underneath a standard MIG welder. And with that, we could print in steels and aluminum and stainless steel. And it's pretty good. So for doing something like fixing your tractor, it's more than good enough. It's got maybe half millimeter of resolution. Um, but for doing, getting the same kind of intricacy that you're used to in plastic printing, which is under 100 microns, we're not there yet, but we're coming fast. And so right now, kind of metal, low-cost 3D printing, open source is where plastic was maybe a decade ago. Like we're moving in the right direction. Lots of people are working on it. It's becoming much more accessible. So basically, if you have any CNC robot, you can attach a welder to it and kind of get this similar results to what we did. And for that type of technology, I don't necessarily think will be in everyone's home, but anywhere where you'd have a machine shop, any type of small business that might do something like fix a car or a tractor, they would have access to the core technology already. And then putting on the kind of CNC 3D robot is not that big of a deal. And so plastic, I would say we almost completely own at this point. Metals, we're pretty far along. And then we're also starting to move into things like ceramics. And so there's many open source 3D printers that can either print like a clay that then you then fire to form a ceramic. We've been messing around with pre-ceramic polymers where you print in plastic, dip it in this polymer that kind of like sucks into the sponge of the print that you just made, and then fire that, and it turns into a high grade, high temperature, high strength ceramic. And so, the applications for these, when you start to combine them, run from everything about, making your own bicycle to making, your bone implant for when you needed jaw surgery. And this is all happening right now. This isn't science fiction. Like the technology's there. There's lots of groups working on 3D printing open source electronics. The idea that there's products that you can't open source now is just fictitious. It's just, we haven't gotten into it yet. As you get more and more complicated, it gets more challenging, but it doesn't mean that we're not going to have a distributed way of manufacturing it in the near future. It's just a little bit of time, a little bit of effort from the maker and open source communities.
Yeah, so rather than waiting to buy a new missing bone or whatever have you, it just gets 3D printed in the hospital's basement, and it comes up from a nice
Right.
little rolling bot that just kind of delivers it.
Yeah, just in time manufacturing, and it's custom for you. Like it can fit your exact bone structure or whatever. Like that is the kind of the true customizable bespoke world that we're moving into.
Yeah, which is kind of, I look at it, being a student of history, as a kind of weird return to pre-industrial times. Because people don't realize before mass manufacturing, everything was bespoke. Houses, clothing, carriages, I mean, everything, the idea of having the same of something and having thousands of it didn't really exist before about 1750.
Right.
And it seems like, and I was thinking this morning because I got a draft of the art of the feature last night and I was reading about it. Um, and I was thinking, how fascinating that we've moved so far forwards, we've gone backwards.
Right.
To now it's going to be, kind of back to where we were before mass manufacturing hit. And I
And
think
I
that's
think
fascinating.
except we still get all the technology, and so it's not that you don't have lights, it's that now, why are all your lights only one color? And why can't they change with the music that you're playing or the time of day or how you're feeling? That's all possible now, with open source tech. That's actually a pretty easy one.
Yeah.
I've got one of my students has a tripped out apartment that he did all the lighting off of an Arduino, and it looks amazing. Like, something that would be in a club a few years ago, he has total complete control over. And that if you think about in the olden times, like sort of the way you dressed said something about how skilled you were, how skilled your loved ones were. And now the way we dress, everybody literally has the same type of clothes. Like, the the Hollywood magazines like compare, who wore what dress better
Yeah.
because there's only so many dresses. Well, now everybody can have a different dress. You could design your own dress and have some real personal pride in the thing that you made. And that's what makes it special. So it's no longer that, my aunt made me this sweater. It's like my aunt made me this sweater. Like this has more valuable to me than what I could pick up at Walmart.
Yeah, and I think I think that's the most fascinating bit is that, yeah, we've gone so far forwards, we've gone backwards, but with all the benefits of what we've done over the last 200 years. I think that is interesting. I think that's an exciting future. I just hope we can arrange it in such a way that we don't all end up homeless in a field. That's the hope.
I agree. That would
Um,
be nice. I think, I think you're even like maybe a closet optimist because when you're saying homeless, you at least have a field to live in. The crops might grow.
That is, yes, absolutely. Yeah, that is very true. That is very true. I mean, yeah, that, or we end up going into like Demolition Man, where we all live in like the basement of some city, on top of each other, and you know, you're making stuff out of a small, crowded shop, and I'm hawking information as an information broker in a trendy cafe, a la every anime ever.
Right.
Sort of, yeah. I mean, there's that future as well. That's maybe not so great, but I mean, this is all fascinating. I'm so glad we were able to introduce this. I think a lot of people just don't know. I had no idea that you folks had come so far. I thought 3D printing was still a rather silly, esoteric thing that would take decades to get anything done. And yet here you are. You've already done it.
But it has come really, really fast. One of the things I do is I print out a new Christmas ornament every year.
Mm.
And, if you look at some of my early Christmas ornaments, like they're objectively terrible. They're like, but I guess back then I could see the potential. Like it had the basic shape that I wanted. It just was terrible. And now like my wife always teases me, like, she's always like, well, I can still see the lines, or that's not quite there yet. Like, why doesn't that have more than one color? Like, when are you going to put that in gold? Like, there's always more. Like, we can always do more. And we are, as a community, really pushing forward. In the olden days, there was only one or two ornaments online, and now you could deck out, all the trees in Times Square, no trouble, with different customized ornaments made by hundreds and hundreds of people.
Yes, and now the next thing you can work on is artificial Christmas tree. You know, so
Yeah.
in the future we don't have to worry about decorating a tree. We'll just have the little MakerBot just 3D print one.
Right. Actually, they do have they have little mini trees, and I guess if you got a big enough printer, you could do a whole tree. Um, there's a really clever design out there where they take advantage of the fact that if you print in air, it makes something like a pine needle,
Right.
and
Yeah.
so you have this thing where it's just printing in air constantly. It's amazing to watch, and it comes out at the end, and it looks like a pine tree. It's really, really pretty cool. So I think we're not too far off from having your customizable, completely open source Christmas tree.
Yeah, no, that's
No trees need to die.
yes, yes, no, no more trees, no more trees need to die. Well, Josh, this conversation has been absolutely fascinating. I appreciate it. Why don't you tell us where people can get your book?
So the book is available at every major retailer. The place to go if you want the hyperlinks. So if you buy the physical books, it doesn't come with hyperlinks, but if you go to appropedia.org/create, you'll see it's appropedia.org/create. You'll have all the hyperlinks for free to all the content I talked about in the book. Some of it was created by myself and my students, but the vast majority of it was created by open source developers and designers all over the world that I'll probably never meet, but I'm very, very thankful that they do it. And the book is available on purchase on Amazon, Barnes & Noble, Indigo, McGraw-Hill, which was the publisher, and many local small bookstores near you.
Yes, and dear listener, if you're in the car, don't worry about writing that down. It will be in the show notes. And thank you so much for taking the time to speak to us twice, Josh. I really appreciate it.
Oh, thank you. It's been very interesting. It's a good challenge to really think about how this will affect the future. Oh, thank you, thank you. Yeah, this has been a lot of fun, and yeah, you do have me thinking how we guide ourselves to a soft landing carefully in the U.S. It's not such a clear path.
No, it's. I mean, I mean, as I was talking before, like I come from an industry that got absolutely decimated by the internet, so I've kind of already seen the dark side of how new tech can take an industry that produced great, wonderful middle class jobs for highly educated people and also kept democracy going. That little thing that we do.
That was so appreciated.
No one really cares about.
Well,
Also, I think, and because of the internet, my industry is dying. Essentially, I was talking to my dad the other day, and he was kind of like, how many more years are you going to work in media? And I said, I don't know, especially with what COVID has done. I don't know that what I do is even sustainable anymore, financially speaking. And so,
yeah.
I kind of look at it as, the internet was supposed to completely revolutionize how we shared information, and it was supposed to create tons of new opportunities. It did that. It also killed everyone's business model and
Right.
unemployed millions of people. And if we do that to global manufacturing, we're not just talking about unemploying Americans. We're talking about unemploying 2/6 of the planet. That's a problem.
Yep.
China will not be excited to hear about this.
Right. I don't know if I told you I did give a talk in Hong Kong at a toy manufacturers conference, and there was dead silence in a room of hundreds of people when I was done.
Yeah, it's because we're all thinking about what I'm thinking about. They were just all watching it all go under.
Yeah, it was an uncomfortable quiet, and
I'm
I was
sure
trying
it
to pitch them
was.
that they if they were going to be mass manufacturing, injection molded plastic dinosaurs, they were in real trouble and they needed to step up the game, and that was not the message I think they wanted me to talk about.
No, I'm sure it wasn't. Yeah.
It's coming hard, and in terms of, I don't think it matters who makes your plastic dinosaurs, but the whole protecting democracy thing, that needs to be done by somebody, and we need to have a method to finance it to ensure that it's done. And that, I think in terms of just a public good, that's something that we should be paying for, but we have to do it in a way that the government isn't, funding the watchdog that's watching them.
Yeah, I mean, that's always the difficulty with, something like the BBC. It's like, can we really expect the BBC to be critical of the entity that pays its bills?
But they do very good critical journalism of other nations.
Yes,
and other things that are going on. So they've got some quality there.
Yeah, no, they do. But I also find one of the problems with the BBC is they have such a Tory bent. you know, that, you know, heaven help a labor government that gets into power. They're fighting, you know, labor has the problem of defending the institution of the BBC while being extremely criticized by it every time they're in power. The irony is tremendous. Like,
Right.
whereas in America, we were very lucky. Our media is in no way tied to our government.
Right.
Unfortunately, it's that business model doesn't work anymore.
And it's being owned by more, like the ownership is getting more and more concentrated.
Yes,
Like it's getting,
in the
frankly, totally scary now, especially newspapers.
yeah,
Like,
yes, newspapers are owned by about 3 or 4 companies. People don't know this. All of television is owned by 3 companies. You know,
yeah,
it's just all kind of shrunk down. You know, forever and ever and ever. And the sad thing is when it comes to like truly independent journalism and all this type of thing. You know, we have those of us online who have been trying to get this off the ground and make this happen and all this type of thing. There's not a company out there that isn't either shilling for donations, shilling for subscriptions, trying to figure out an advertising model that works. No one has
right,
figured out how to. No one has figured out how to fix the business model of what we do.
right. Now it's very hard now because I think the fallback is to go to advertising, and
And we
you get
have
a
done.
tiny piece of that pie.
Well,
Well,
and the problem is that the whole advertising ecosystem is controlled by Facebook and Google.
right,
That's what really killed journalism. Newspapers had this wonderful thing, classified sections, that totally paid the bills. And
right,
in the pre-internet days, it was great because newspapers could invest in all sorts of things, and they had the classified section to keep the lights on. And then Google came along and took 3/4 of that market, and then Facebook came along and gobbled up what was left. And the problem is, for those of us that work in media, we can't get out to people because of social media. We have to pay to do that, and they've taken all of our ad dollars. And
right.
the whole thing is controlled by 2 companies. So,
Oh, there's
so we're all stuck shilling constantly to make Google and Facebook happy, so that maybe they'll let 5 people see what we've done. It's the worst duopoly, and that's why media sucks. And as a result, democracy is literally crumbling before our eyes.
well, it makes it very hard because makes it very hard to be critical of Google and Facebook. Like,
It does.
yeah, it's mind-boggling actually. So, one of the things in the book that I'm kind of quite proud of is I did a little mini study on open source ad blockers. And in the study, we basically showed that the average internet user would save 100 hours a year, which is a heck of a lot of time. And that time is based on the additional time it takes you to load a web page that you're going to look at because of the ads.
Mm-hmm.
With an ad blocker, it's scraped away. And I was talking to another kind of like an editor of a blog, and she'd posted the blog, and I was like, "Oh, it's all messed up." And she's like, "No, it's not." And I went back in, and it turned out to be the ad blocker. The blog had so many ads on it
Yeah.
that it torched the formatting. And she was like, "Oh, don't worry about it. Less than 10% of people use ad blockers." Like,
Yeah.
that's right there the problem. And so you need the ads to generate the revenue to pay anybody, like say independent journalists. And at the same time, almost all the wealth that are generated by the ads are going back to a couple companies, and none of it is benefiting the users or the content creators in any kind of serious, meaningful way. And we're in this is a rough time in history, and we'll see. Maybe things will change. You know, a simple policy change could correct all of this quite quickly.
Yeah, I mean, I think when it comes to media advertising, you know, we broke up AT&T because they ran all the phones. We made movie theaters separate from movie studios because that vertical integration was keeping people out of the market. It was killing independent film because the big studios controlled all the theaters. So they could always squash the competition by never releasing any films that weren't their own.
Right.
And they did that until the 50s when the government said, no, we're not going to do that. I don't necessarily think Facebook and Google should be broken up as such, because I think the whole software services ecosystem would fall apart. But when it comes to the advertising, we need to figure out some way to regulate that, and we need to break up that duopoly somehow.
It's going to be very interesting to see if we have the political will to pull it off.
In the last page of my first book, What the Hell is Going On?
Yeah.
I said there isn't a single problem in this country we cannot solve. We lack the political will to do so.
Right.
The solution to pretty much everything we've got wrong is right in front of us. We have no political will to implement it. And that's not a problem you fix very fast.
Yeah. Well, we might think. Well, I'm somewhat hopeful that things might change substantially when people see the ramifications of our choices, and I think it's becoming more and more evident. But we'll see. Yeah.
No,
I'm hopeful.
I know. I'm hopeful. I'm hopeful as well. I just am. I am sad to be, potentially getting driven out of what I do best because a working business model for it no longer exists. That's
right.
That's the difficult, for me, the difficult part, because I don't really know how much longer this can go on, especially with what's happened with COVID and all this type of thing. It may be time to hang it up sooner rather than later. I don't know.
I'm still. I hope you're wrong. I hope that another year from now, when things get pretty much back to normal, that we'll have a good, strong, actual, real recovery, and kind of set things on the right path again.
Yeah.
Obviously, this was a giant mess. I mean, yeah, this is a giant mess.
And it's the mess that keeps on giving.
Right.
No, indeed. Yeah, it's going to be a hard time, and it will be interesting to see, who survives and what consolidation happens. And because that's every time there's a big economic crisis, there's always a consolidation in media. Deals start getting done, people start buying products and all this type of thing. So it'll be interesting to see what comes out the other side. But
yep.
That's all for this episode of the Cameron Journal podcast. Thank you so much for listening. Visit us online at CameronJournal.com. We're on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram, and I love to talk to my followers and listeners, so please feel free to get us on social media at Cameron Cowan on Twitter, and we'll see you next time on the Cameron Journal podcast.